Hello and welcome back to Math with Tiffany. Today we're covering exponents. An exponent is when you see a number, let's call it x, raised to a power. So your x is called your base and your n is your exponent. And it's just telling you how many times we use that number in multiplication. So like, 4 squared is 4 times 4, and 4 to the 6th is 4 6 times. So 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 times 4 times 4. So you have 4 6 times. And we just use exponents because it's a lot easier to write 4 to the 6th than it is to write this long thing over here, especially when you get into really big exponents, or if you're doing if you get into physics and you're working with really tiny numbers, you'll have things raised to like the 16th or to the 32nd or stuff like that. So it's just a lot easier to write that than the big long thing. And then we're going to also talk about a negative exponents. So you can have a negative exponent, so you can have x to the negative n. And this is telling you how many times you divide 1 by that number. So 1 divided by x to the n. So if you have 5 to the negative 2, that's telling you 1 divided by 5 divided by 5, which can be written as 1 over 5 squared. This is important to know because if you have a negative exponent in your numerator, then you can put it in your denominator and make it a positive exponent. So that's kind of like what we did here. We did the reciprocal. So yeah. So let's just talk about, before I forget, when you're working with exponents in your calculator, your calculator is kind of picky, and it doesn't understand implications of what you mean, so overuse parentheses in your calculator. It's very important. You can never overuse them. So this means, like, if you have a negative base, so like negative 5 squared does not equal, open parentheses, negative 5 squared in your calculator. Because this side is telling your calculator the opposite of 5 squared. It does 5 squared, which is 25, and then it puts a negative in front of it, negative 25. While this side is telling your calculator, do negative 5 squared. So that's telling your calculator, do negative 5 times negative 5, which is positive 25. So just remember that when you're doing your calculator stuff to put your parentheses around your base, so it includes that negative if you want it included. So now we're gonna go over just the law of exponents. So I'm gonna write these starting on this side over here. So we're gonna do that in green. Laws. So I'm writing laws. I'm writing them generally. So I'm gonna be writing like x. X is as your base because it can be any number you want. It applies to any number that you can put as a base. And I will be using probably m and n for exponent numbers, because those can be any numbers you want. And I'll give examples for each law. So your first law is x to the 1 equals x. And your example for that is like, 6 to the 1 equals 6. So any number you raise to the 1 power is that number, because you're not multiplying that number by anything. If you plug it into your, over here to what it is, if you do 4 to the 1, that's 4 times nothing, so it's 4. And then you have x to the 0 power is 1. So if you have 5 to the 0, that equals 1. So any number raised to the 0 power is 1. x to the negative 1 is 1 over x. And that goes back to our negative exponents that we talked about over on this side. So you have 3 to the negative 1 equals 1/3. Because again, I mean, you're just writing this 1 over 3, because it's still, to the power of 1, technically. So yeah. And next page. Okay. And then you have a number, a base, x to the m times x to the n, that equals x to the m plus n. This is important because your bases have to be the same for this to work like this. And the reason this works is because this is saying, I'm going to explain it, is, so if you have like 3 squared times 3 to the 1, if you rewrite it, it's 3 times 3 times 3, and that is 3/3, which is 2 plus 1. And that works for any exponent as long as your bases are the same. And then you have x to the m divided by x to the n, and that is x to the m minus n. And this just goes back to your division rules, because if you have, say, 5 to the 3rd over 5 squared, that is 5 times 5 times 5, and this is 5 times 5. Well, then these 5s cancel, and it just leaves you 5, and that's 3 minus 1. And that's why that works. And then we have x to the m raised to the n, and this is x mn, because you're multiplying your exponents. So if you have x squared raised to the 3rd, that is x to the 2 times 3, which is x to the 6th power. And let's scroll down. And again, I'm explaining this one. So if we break this down, do this, parentheses first, then exponents. You have x times x, and then you're doing that 3 times. So, and that equals x times x times x times x times x times x. And then that's 6 x's, so you have x to the 6th. And that's why that works. And then we have x, y to the n. So this is if you have 2 different bases raised to the same exponent. You have x to the n, y to the n. So your exponent goes into both of, goes to both of those. Because again, if you rewrite this, you have xy to the 3rd, then you're multiplying your x's and y's 3 times. So you have xy, 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 and then you can simplify that by combining like terms, and you'll have x to the 3rd, y to the 3rd, because you have 3 x's and then 3 y's. And that's why that works. And then we have, scroll down more, there's lots of laws. X divided by y to the n, and this is the same principle going on that we just talked about. You'll have x to the n over y to the n. Your exponent again goes to both. It's important. So if you have, 3 divided by 4 to the 6, it's 3 to the 6 over 4 to the 6. Goes both for the same reason we talked about above. Multiply that out, you'll get 3. You'll get 6 x's and 6 y's and all that fun stuff. And then our x to the negative n equals 1 over x to the n. And we've already talked about that. So you have x to the negative 3 equals 1 over x cubed. And then on our next video, we're going to talk about fractional exponents. So if you have x to the m divided by n, so if you have a fraction as an exponent, we're going to talk about that in our next video because that corresponds to how we get a square root or cube roots or any roots that you want to talk about. And we'll talk about those in our next video. Thank you for checking in with Math with Tiffany.